It's so good to see you.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Thanks. So before we get started on particular questions that I have for you around race, around God, around our common ontology and so on, like, where would you start? What do you want to just tell me and teach me?
Oh my gosh.
I'm your student today.
That's such an open question.
Is it too open, do you think? Or
no, I think it's humbling. But I think for me, if I was to start anywhere, I go back to, I think it's and. I think and is such a big word, particularly in a life that's lived a lot in dualities or, polarities and things. And I think the polarities keep us like ping pong, just volleying back and forth. And so I think at the place where, and I've really been sitting and stirring a lot inside of that, but I think at the place where we can hold the complexities and of our histories, and the place where we are with distinction of particularities, along with, and the commonalities of our ontology and our origin, I think maybe we begin to find a way forward instead of having to be this way or this way. So that's
maybe
kind of
we could reserve that as a book title for you, like, and what a great book. Well, this will be good. I know. You and I know a few things about trying to sort out book titles, don't we? So that's really helpful then to right away say, look, we're not erasing particularity, but we want to transcend the hostilities around polarization, and that common ground doesn't have to be an excuse for erasure. Does that sound right?
Yes, I think so. And because I think on both ends of the spectrum, it's important to be able to very tenderly hold both the anger and the fear, while not being driven by either the anger or the fear.
So what does holding, I'm used to this expression from spiritual direction kind of circles, right? Holding anger and holding fear when the instinct is to like drive them out or to somehow repress them, which doesn't really make them go away. It just kind of toxifies them. So maybe you can tell me just a little more. What does holding anger look like? And what does holding fear look like?
That's a really good question. So for me, I think the first thing it starts with is an acknowledgement that this is what's rising within me. And I think somatically is noting where that tension or where that fear or anger or expression may be physically in our bodies, because a lot of times our bodies keep the score of the feelings that we normally deny or repress or don't know how to name. And so just my own personal space with that, when I note it, when I acknowledge it, when I sense it in the atmosphere or in another person that is before me, I tend to just kind of put my hand over my heart and name it in that. And because I think that's the first thing is acknowledging. And then from there, what we've been taught to do is to try to immediately repress it, cut it off, or change it, discard it. And so when I say that I'm holding it,
I gotta fix this now.
Exactly. So when I say that I'm holding it, my immediate sensation is not to fix it or to make it better or to make it disappear. It's to give it room to be, and allow it to be what it is without having to make it something else. But I think because we haven't been given the space to sit with negative emotions, or even just because of that, because we've named these feelings as negative, our first instinct is to want to distance ourselves from them. And so, but how we navigate a very complicated conversation is going to have to start with some ability to sit in our discomfort, you know?
Mhm. So then let's say you try to hold it,
Yeah.
holding anger, holding fear, in giving it that space. Do you have like ways that we can avoid being completely swallowed by it?
Yeah.
Like, you know, if I start to let my anger out sometimes,
Yes.
I feel like I'm losing control. The solution doesn't seem to be control. And the solution also doesn't seem to be like smashing everything in front of me,
Right.
especially other people.
Yeah.
So do you have hints about that?
Yeah, and I would go back to and, right? Because I think this is the beauty of our interconnectedness, that we are not meant to journey alone. And I do feel like for most people, that getting in touch with those feelings, allowing those feelings to be, can be very scary. For some, it may even seem like just on the brink of insanity, of, you know, not being able to control myself and my actions and how I interact with this. But there's something about companioning together, particularly through hard spaces and unknown spaces. There's something very grounding, right? When I am kind of, you know, discombobulated and things are a little disconcerted, that I can look into your eyes. I go back in my head to Psalms 32:8 that says, I will guide you with my eye. But there's something that is very grounding about the peace of knowing that I'm not alienated or alone in the middle of that, that I can look into another human's eye, someone who loves me and cares for me, or a spiritual director or a guide or a companion or a mentor, and not have to face that alone, you know, because
Yeah.
for some people, that's a really hard thing to try to sit in those feelings by themselves. And so I would very much say to other people, this is where the circle of friendship, to be able to reach out to other people and just ask for someone to be with me in that process, not necessarily to fix me, but even just to hold my hand or to be there, to know that I have a grounding and anchor that's beyond myself as I'm walking through this.
Yeah.
So,
Like in my case as a white person, I need to be super mindful of when I'm feeling defensive. And maybe feeling defensive is when if I'm feeling initial discomfort,
yeah.
my unwillingness to hold it is the defensiveness.
Yes.
Right. But if I can say, whoa, what if this discomfort is a transforming fire? If I'm willing to stay in it, instead of be reactive, which is just not working. It's just not working
I
at all.
think that's the thing too, Brad, though, is that process takes time. And in a microwave society that believes we can, you know, in the Christian setting, and I did inner healing for years, but you know, we would have an hour and a half inner healing session with the belief that you can bring me years and years and years of your trauma and your pain and this and that, and we can go through this together, and you can walk out completely different. And that is not to negate the process, because I have seen Jesus really meet people in that and show up and do phenomenal work. But I do believe that, again, the companioning, the sitting together, the praying together, that it is a beginning, it's an invitation into a journey. And it is a journey that is really lifelong. It takes time, you know, and so, and I think part of the discomfort that we feel, particularly around issues of race right now, is we want to hurry up and get to something that feels more at ease, more harmonious, you know, all of those kinds of things. And so we do kind of rush for whatever fix can get us past discomfort. And I don't know that that's the answer.
Yeah. Well, it feels too then like when it comes to like the fact that you and I are part of one human race, but within that race, there's beautiful diversity. I think we'd agree that the solution is not to create a homogeneous. How do you say that, Felicia? I'm used to reading it, and you know where from, a homogeneous unit. That's what we were actually advised to do by the Fuller Church planting people. It's easier to plant a church out of a homogeneous unit. So find people that are all, and I'm just like, this is not the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that? I kind of know what you think. I'd like to hear you articulate what you think about that.
Yeah, again, I go back first into history, and I think about all the places where, particularly as a Black person in America, growing up in the South, you had these two really distinct kind of viewpoints on that. And so one viewpoint recognized that for safety and for success and achievement and moving up, the idea was that you just assimilate it. So you assimilated it as much as you could, despite your color, into that homogenous kind of being, and so, and for that, it was, for Southern Blacks anyway, the whites kind of set the standard for what that was, and whatever that was for them, that's the place you were trying to get to. So it was kind of this assimilation into as much as you can. And one of a theologian that I follow, Dr. Barbara Holmes, she talks a lot about a Blackness in response to whiteness. And so I see that kind of thing, even though I could never externally change my skin color, I could try to do as much as I could to assimilate into this homogenous lifestyle that would at least make me acceptable. And then you had, on the other side, people that didn't necessarily want to assimilate. What they wanted was just to be equal, just for my humanity to be equal. And, so that was more their thing, was kind of like the separate but equal thing. And again, I go back to polarities. I wonder if acceptance of my being, regardless of what my being looks like and my distinctions and all of that, and the place where we share a commonality of origin, is how we live and move and have our being. And I look at that through the Trinity, not through, this idea that, sure, I can make everything homogenous. That makes it really easy, right? But is that really, when we look at Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the model of life and relational dynamics that we have before us?
Yeah. Well, see, I'm glad I asked you that, because I've never seen this before, that on both ends of the polarity, whether segregation or assimilation, they share a common problem. They're both a way of being homogenous, right? So if we just have absolute segregation of all our cultures and classes and colors, then each of those is this homogeneous unit separate from all the others. But if you try to just do the melting pot, then if the most powerful group in the room is really just saying, you be like us now, you still haven't solved the problem, have you? Right. So communities that not only celebrate diversity, but get to experience it, seems exciting.
It's like when you mentioned, it's like making a dish and one seasoning overpowers everything else. And you really can't taste anything else. But one of the best dishes is the one where all of the flavors kind of, they complement one another, and they blend together in a way that I could be munching on this, and I taste this, and I taste this, and this rises to the surface. And there's just this dance. And again, when I go back to, for me, looking at the Trinity and the relationship of the Trinity and the way they do that, there's a beautiful complement to the Trinity. There's a beautiful dance. There is no one is overpowering the other or any of that. And you get to experience, Father as Father and Jesus as Jesus and Holy Spirit as Holy Spirit. And so I think within that, there's an invitation for us to be able to do the same with one another.
Yeah.
I hope so.
So that would be, I think that recipe analogy is super good. So if, because then if I'm told, look at, the problem isn't that you're white, but could you just dial it down a bit? Then I'm like, well, wait a minute. Should I be defensive? It's like, no, it's just like the amount of spice in this thing is burning my lips right off. So could we balance it out a bit? By the way, fun side story. I don't know if you've eaten kimchi. I have a Korean daughter-in-law, and I have to confess I don't like kimchi. But what I can say about it is that the Koreans brought the pickling to it that gives it the sour taste, but it was actually Portuguese who showed up, who said, we should try adding pepper to this. And they're the ones who made it hot. And then the Koreans went, oh, this is good. And so it's a beautiful blend of, like, if we really make space for one another, the outcomes are pretty cool. So let me ask you.
One of my favorite restaurants in Atlanta, Brad, actually is a Korean barbecue fusion.
Oh, there we go.
So it's
fusion.
All like Southern barbecue. You have your pulled pork, your sweet potatoes, your collard greens, and then it's all like kimchi is added on top of the sweet potatoes, and it's just a fusion of the two foods. And it's so interesting how they marry together and taste phenomenally. But
what an analogy then, right? So not homogeneous, but true fusion.
Yes.
Where you can identify diversity and see how they have a perichoretic kind of yumminess.
Yeah.
Very good. So let's say, then let me ask you this. If we bring Black into the recipe, I'm still working out what Black means. Is it a culture? Is it a color? Is it a history?
Right.
How do you define that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think a lot of people are probably still trying to work out what white means too. I was telling someone this, maybe it was you and I talking about this a few days ago, whatever, but in Africa, there are no Blacks, right? And so in Africa, people are Yoruba, they're, whatever tribe is there, they're Ghanaian, they're Nigerian, they're, all of those kinds of things. There's not Black, but Black encompasses, say, people from the West Indies, all of that. So it would be, yes, I think culture. And I think, again, I have to go back to history and how we even got to Black, white, Asian, all the different constructs of race that we have. And which is so interesting because you have to go back to capitalism and greed and corruption and that. But, as far as America, when you had people immigrate to America, they were Irish, they were Polish, they were Hungarian, they were Italian, they were whatever country they were coming from. And they brought their culture, their food, their dances, their clothing, their ways of being here. And then when America became America, the people of import and the people of power were white, wealthy, land-owning men, and then everyone else, right? And so, but what happened is when those people in power, the white, wealthy, land-owning men, needed to make a distinction between the Blacks and everyone else, they went to poor what we would now say white people, and basically invited them into, no longer being Irish, Polish, this or that. They became kind of known as white people. And it took, even for where you had class status, where you might have had some free blacks or whatever over people who didn't own land. Now, all of a sudden, just to be white kind of catapulted you over being a person of color or indigenous or whatever like that. And there was an intent to kind of classify or castigate, or, this hierarchical thing that dominates and subjugates people that happened inside of it. And so when we talk about, what is Black, what is white, I think we have to hold the history to how we got there with how people have then lived for hundreds and hundreds of years inside of that, and what has been the result of that. And so for the idea of Blackness, or the idea of being Black, I would say it's the survival, the thriving, the flourishing that happened within the food, within the community, within the childbearing and raising, the persistence, and all of those things. But it's so much wider, because we can always get narrower in our countries and things. It's so much wider than just America and what happened here. You look globally across Australia, New Zealand, even in Canada, where you are, and then again to the islands and the Caribbeans and things. And everyone has some sense of culture, some sense of community, some sense of heritage that they're bringing to these ideas. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of clashing, is because we're all trying to take these words and make them something global and universal, when we all have individualized and very specific ideas of what they mean to us.
So yeah, so that's a place where you're really clearing up a confusion for me. Well, I'm kind of getting there with your help, with Chris Green's help, and some of these folks, where on the one hand, seeing the negative aspect of race as a power construct used to exclude, and on the other side, seeing race as a treasury of culture and language and music and food, but also that a shared history of the experience of those who've been oppressed, and then also the heritage that preceded that somehow. Because like, it can sound like a double bind if on the one hand you say, well, race is a construct, and I'm like, okay, hear that, then so that must be a bad thing. And then I hear, don't be colorblind. Well, wait a minute, but that's a bad thing. So which is it then, right? And what you've done is navigate a way for me to see that, I think. Is there anything else you'd want to say to clarify that?
Yeah, I think you're on it. And again, very individualized, right? I think for me, I've reached a place where I understand how we got there as far as race being a construct. I'm not at the place where I think the correction to that is to erase it completely, because I think we have navigated hundreds and hundreds of years of, now that we have this, now this. And what I sit in is, I'm looking at, how do I participate with the divine in the restoration and the reclamation of this for good?
Yeah.
Right? Where this is love coming into the fury of our evil, the hell of the oppression, and then redeeming it and resurrecting it with new life, right? And I think often of our friend Paul Young, when he wrote The Shack, and the place in the book where the blood stain is on the floor in the cabin, and then at the end, their blood stain wasn't there. And someone once asked Paul, if there was something that you could change about that writing, what would you change? And Paul said, I would go back and put the blood stain back on the floor of the cabin.
Yeah.
And and I think that I feel this way about the idea of race as a construct. I don't think the answer is to erase the bloodstain.
Yeah.
I think the bloodstain remains, and we see how love is resurrecting this and how we can get to love's ideal for humanity within what we have.
Sure, like even the wounds of Christ or the symbol of the cross, how that it means something different now in the sense of redemption. And I need my God to bear wounds, my wounds, the wounds I've inflicted, the ones I've endured. Yes. And that it's not just forgotten, but it also means love to me now, rather than just a perpetual trauma. Yes. I used to think that racism is when you just sort of like, when one race hates another race. But now in recent years, I've thought, no, racism is more than, because it's not just, well, a black person who hates a white person is a racist too. There seems to be more around, there's a power dynamic going on in racism that doesn't make it symmetrical. Am I on to something there?
Yes, I would totally agree with that. I think what you first described, I would probably more call prejudice. And I do think, Black people can have anti-white biases and be prejudiced against white people, just as, vice versa, white people can have
prejudging.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, I definitely think that, particularly based on how we deal with our lived experiences and the things that we've been taught and passed down and all of that. But I think when you look specifically at racism, you have to look at prejudice plus power and how it has played into and perpetuated systems of oppression in different, spheres and arenas around us. And so, when you talk about racism in that regard, when people try to talk about reverse racism or Black people being racist against white people, I would say when you look at power, there really has never been, again, I'm in America, so I'm going to use America because that's what I'm familiar with, but there's never been a time when there's been a system or a structure in place for Black people as a whole to hold the power to oppress and deny the livelihood and existence of white people in the way that racism does. So it is the prejudice plus the power that creates systems that deny the full existence or livelihood of another, would be racism.
So we have this common phrase now, systemic racism. You started going there a little bit. So what is systemic racism? I think you just defined it, but is there more to say about that when people hear that word?
Yeah, and in a nutshell, that really is. So systemic racism, you're going to be looking at the systems that are in place that have intentionally or unintentionally harmed or oppressed or kept any body of people from a sense of equity. So I would go, when you look at the housing system, in America, we had what was called redlining, which was a very detailed map that bankers had and mortgage lenders had. And what they did was, you could see it on the maps, and these maps actually still exist, but there were certain areas of town that had a red line, and very intentionally, those houses were devalued and marked lower than parts of, other parts of town. And so, and what the bankers and mortgage lenders did, Black people could only live there. So if they tried to get approved for a loan, for a house in a different part of town, they were often not approved or whatever. So you saw the same thing when they created the GI Bill, and the VA had it where when the veterans came back from war, they could use this bill to not have to pay a down payment for a home. But classically, repeatedly, Black veterans were denied use of their VA bill, and they did not get the same benefits that, white veterans did coming back. So you have that instance. For one,
Is that what redistricting is about too? In
Yes.
elections? Yeah.
Yes.
To
Very much
suppress
so.
Black voters and yeah.
Yes. And so these are all different types of systems. You see it in the education system with, we won't even go into the latest thing, but you see it in the education system with allotment for books and things like that. And so very much like in the US, they use the census to decide how many representatives you have in an area, how much money is going to go towards education, public education and things like this. And so generally what has happened is there have been more distribution of wealth to areas where there is less Black people and things. And so you have bad textbooks, bad schools, all these kinds of things happen. These are all systems that happen within what you would call systemic racism.
So now the hot button right now is, of course, critical race theory. And I've heard you talk about that as it's being used as a distraction. But is that what critical race theory was about? Studying that system? It was something else?
Critical race theory was something else altogether, and in the sense that Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal professor who even coined the term, this is a term that was used in academia, higher education. It really wasn't the way people have weaponized it and used it today to create fear. And I do really believe a distraction. It was not intended for those purposes. So you're talking about, just like many other higher education theories, this is a theory that was talked about within the classroom to talk about the legal implications for when you're looking at mass incarceration issues and different things like that, that most people weren't interested in, didn't have the expertise or background in. It was really inside of the legal field for them as an explanation to explain some of the issues that you were seeing in the justice system and things like that. And what has happened now is people have honed in on this word without really understanding, again, the history, the origin, the intent of it, pulled it outside of academia, outside of the halls of academia and higher education, and trying to use it as a blanket word and trying to say that, essentially, Black people want to introduce this into all elements of education to make white people feel bad or to make white people feel as if they are oppressors and to create culture wars. And one, that was not at all how it was intended from its onset. And then two, I think for me, instead of trying to defend what it is and how it was used, I would rather ask the question, what's stoking the fear, right? And so why have we removed this word from its intent and brought it out into mainstream and weaponized it to erase our history, deny our history, and to reduce the humanity of other people? And when I talk about the humanity, I mean every part of our humanness, our frailties and our failures and the places where we partner with evil instead of good. These are as much a part of us as the light and the love and the truth and goodness. And it is in those places that God comes in with love to redeem us. And God comes in to bring us into our full self, that we come home to the ontology of our being and the truth of our being and who we are in Him. But if we erase the places that are opportunities for love to come in and redeem, where do we go? That's an illusion, that's deception, and so I want to be careful that we're not using words and terms to keep us from the opportunities where love can come into and burn away the things that are not of love's kind.
Yeah, it seems to me that part of the fear is like, well, if you're, when I hear this history, then I feel bad. and so, and if I feel bad, and well, you just want me to hate America or something. I mean, I actually hear that stuff. And what I'm hearing you say is you have to go through that to get to the reconciliation and love. But without confession, if you live in defensiveness and denial, you won't get to that outcome. Is that what you mean?
We think that we're okay. And the reality is, yes, and you know, when I look at the truth of my being, the truth of our being as humanity, and in that sense, ontologically, we are okay. But we have to be also truthful. Here's the and again, right? And we have to be truthful about the ways that we forgot that we were okay, that we forgot that we are the Imago Dei, and that we have participated with ills. And that is not to shame or to label or to, and I think in that regard, guilt and shame becomes detractors of empathy. And they prohibit us from really owning the truth of, you know, it's, and what I hear a lot is that was my ancestors, or I wasn't alive during that time, or whatever, or why are we still going back? Why are we still going back to that? And for me, I would then point to the systemic racism that has been perpetuated. And not, so a lot of people individually are, they're doing the work themselves, but the systems, the powers are still in place that are still, you know, oppressing people, that there are still marginalized people. And so when again I look at the life of Jesus, there was a full inclusion of everyone. There was a you know, there was thought around, and I'm maybe projecting my own desire onto what I see of Jesus, but I feel like there was some intentionality of heart with the interaction with women, with the Samaritan, with, you know, and so I'm looking at, for my own self, how am I relating to when I vote, when I choose my elected officials, when I'm spending my money, how is this helping to participate in the people that are on the margins? How is this helping to include them? And where am I still aligning myself with systems of oppression that are not allowing people to exist in the fullness of their humanity?
Yeah. Okay, so I want to run something by you that's a reality in Canada.
Okay.
For your analysis around the Indigenous folks. So I hear you and I believe you, and I've watched you in practice not weaponize this issue for guilting and shaming. And I'm really appreciative of that. It's why I see you as today's Howard Thurman. But I'm also aware that there are those who do want to weaponize the history of racism and the abuse and oppression of the marginalized, precisely in order to invert power. So not, you know, not to divest it, not to deal with it, but actually, okay, now it's our turn to be that. And the horrible thing, I'll get to Canada in a second as an illustration. The horrible thing, in my opinion, is, or one of them, is when white progressives do that performatively. So in Canada, we have this horrendous history of abuse of First Nations people. And then we had these discoveries, which were no surprise actually, but it was a new traumatizing event where we found all these unmarked graves of Indigenous kids. And then I can't critique, it's not for me to critique those who, in the pain and rage of those discoveries, torched some churches and vandalized them. That's not my place to deal with levels of frustration. But what I saw was white progressives cheering that on, even when it was burning down churches on native land attended by indigenous people. And the irony of that was so frustrating to me, and it makes space in my heart for like things that I shouldn't have. I don't want contempt in there. I don't want malice, but I'm like, here's these grieving, and in some cases, the chiefs and elders of those communities resisting the arson, while outsiders trying to massage their own guilt, I suppose, or to look like allies, are kind of just like, yeah, burn it all down and burn all faith down. And then the indigenous folks are like, wait a minute, some of us have faith, you know? And it's like, well, go learn your history then. And it's just such a mess up here. If I were to bring a question to all that, other than your general analysis, it's like, is there a way to do this that doesn't just say, okay, now it's our turn for power over? How can you help us?
Lord, in your mercy. Right?
Yeah.
I think this is the difference between power over and power with. And so I, as you were sharing, I was thinking about, so Doug and I used to be pastors, and several years ago, we actually planted a church. And I remember, you know, when we were planting the church, we got a lot of people that were disenchanted with churches they knew. And they decided that they would be part of the church planting team because they wanted to do church differently, right? And so we started really leaning into doing church differently. And then into the church plant, we realized that we were saying we were doing church differently, but really we were just recreating what we already knew. And so everyone has this language of wanting to do something differently, and it ends up being exactly the same. And I think this is for me anyway, Richard believes that you can have good hierarchy. I don't know that how I feel about that. But I think when you have been born into a hierarchical system, and when you read, particularly into the scriptures, literally, where it says the first shall be last and the last shall be first, then in your mind, all you see is flipping the power over so that those who didn't have power now have power, as if that's what that means. But I really feel like I go back again to Jesus, and I go back to Jesus didn't come to negate that, right? Like he didn't come to negate the law. He came to fulfill it. So that worked for what it worked for. But then when we look at Jesus, there's this invitation into a new way of being, a new relational way. Everything that you see about him is so relational. You know, it's a relational thing to it. There's some questions being asked. There's always this invitation to be awake and to bring yourself to it, right? And so even when I look at the perichoretic interaction between Father, Jesus, and Holy Spirit, I'm gonna kind of go to a geometry thing because I like math. But when you talk about perichoresis and a circle, right? So I see power with along this. I don't see a place where there's power over, because when you look at a circle, the beginning dot on the circle, that radii, like Jesus the alpha, and then Jesus the omega. How I go from alpha to omega on a circle is to take my little compass thing and draw it around, and I end up where I began. That's a circle. And so I wonder if we moved away from this domination paradigm, this hierarchical where someone dominates and someone subjugates, and we fall between the cracks of this domination paradigm into what I believe Jesus was modeling for us in the way of love, which is a communion paradigm, where, and you see this again within the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there's power with. That love was power with. It was never one over the other. There's mutuality, there's self-emptying, there's, and so I wonder if the invitation is for communion paradigm. And instead of us cheering that we are exploiting and we're destroying, which are all not the ways of love, that there would be invitation into a different model, that we would begin to do life differently, and that we wouldn't just recreate something of the same. Because this has been the way wars have started and ended and keep being perpetuated, is someone's dominated, someone's subjugated, and then there's a use up of power, there's a war, and we get this militant kind of thing that continues and that continues. And that's not to deny our pain or to deny the anger, but it's an invitation to do something differently with it than destruction. That would be my heart.
That's
is
good.
Again, back to Anne, right? That we can hold. And I don't know the quote well enough to, but I'm thinking of Martin Luther King, and I think he said something like, riots are the language of the unheard, or something like that. And I don't quite remember it all. To quote it accurately, I'll try to find it for you. But I remember someone asking King, because of his nonviolent stance, about that, about the rioting and about, what he was seeing. And he tried to explain that this uprising was happening largely because these people feel unheard. And it goes back to how we started with that, when the pain rises, when the anger rises, when the fear rises, some people will repress it and push it back down. Some people will emit it in ways that are violent and harmful. But I think there's an invitation with love to learn how to hold space for it and allow it to be transformed for our good, without it creating chaos. Yeah,
I feel like somewhere someone told me, when you see rage, there's always a sense of being trapped.
Yeah.
Like, and so how does this group feel trapped? Because that's where it's coming from. And asking them to trap their own rage then at that point is a terrible irony. But perhaps it's like what Dr. King showed us, is that he could transpose the energy that came from that rage, and things like the marches worked because you're solving that sense of trappedness in that moment. You're actually releasing them on a massive scale. And
right.
So
I remember them talking about some of the elders now, but they were students of SNCC, the Southern Nonviolent Committee, their movement back then, and how they spent hours and hours training. And part of their training was to sit while others of them yelled in their face and spit at them, to simulate what they would experience when they actually were, sitting in at the counters and doing that. And so that they had to deal with what was rising. And they did that first together in private, things in basements of churches and things like that, before they ever went out to do a sit-in at a counter or to be faced with the dogs and the hoses. They had done some, not just, some external work, there was some internal work that had to be done to face their own inner rage, to face what that was going to be like. And they were ready for those moments. And I wonder how much we have moved from the interior work. Howard Thurman talks about our inner sea, And I wonder how much of our inner sea we've left turbulent. And so that comes forth in the rage. But even right? So when I saw January 6th here in America with the insurrection that happened in our castle, in our capital, I saw the same thing. I saw people that felt trapped, people that felt scared. And so you can see it both, but the thing that was so interesting is when there were young Black people protesting and marching after George Floyd was murdered, after Breonna Taylor was murdered, when rioting or looting happened, it was the worst thing ever and no one could explain it. And when that same thing happened on January 6th and the color was different, it was an acceptable protest of their own feelings of entrapment and rage. So I would go back to the reason why I could hold space for, and not to condone or dismiss or whatever what happened on January 6th, but the reason why I could see it and point to it was because I understood that same rage and feelings of being unheard and not seen from young Black teens and young women and men that have been marching in the street for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Well, and there's a question of whether the leadership, the people who they look to as leaders are actually stirring that up to create a sense of trappedness, to mobilize them for nefarious purposes and so on. So you have, I've kept you a long time, but I so appreciate this. I want to start winding down now, but you did mention Thurman. If we post this, not everybody knows who that is, but to me, he's been a real North Star in learning how to hear what's left of the gospel in America. So can you give us a sense of who he is and what he contributed?
Yeah, I can definitely try. Howard Thurman was I will say that it's really sad that he is not known with the likes of, say, a Thomas Merton, because his work was of that kind of caliber. Howard Thurman was a leader in but a behind the scenes leader. He was a mentor to Martin Luther King, to a lot of people to Jesse Jackson, to a lot of people in the civil rights movement. He was their pastor. He was their confidant. He was the place that when they were battered and bruised and didn't know where to turn, they would show up at Thurman's house. Before he died, he kept meticulous notes of people that he mentored and conversations they had. But before he died, he burned them all because he wanted to honor their confidence. Howard Thurman was the first man to pastor a multiracial church in America, not just in the demographics of his parishioners, but also in leadership. He very much was a person who believed in interspirituality and interfaith. He was mentored by Rufus Jones and the Quaker movement. His grandmother was a slave, and so she very much informed and influenced his ways of being. He grew up in Florida and is known as a nature mystic. He would go out amongst the trees and the arbors and spend time and know God, even as a young boy in that. And so he ended up being dean of chapel at Howard University, Boston University. There's a documentary of him on PBS that people can find. And then he's written, I want to say upward of 20 books, but his most popular one is probably Jesus and the Disinherited. And so I would highly recommend people start there with Howard Thurman. But he, to me, is an apostle of love. And everything that I could ever hope to be in my being, I find in Howard Thurman. And so, like you said, he is a true North Star for me. But
for me, he's so important right now for that very purpose, and that is this: with all of the hostility going on around now, and then let's say opportunities for breakthroughs that get squandered somehow, and the message that I've been seeing more and more frequently and more quickly is a shift from we need to make love central to love is actually compromising with sin and complicity with injustice, and love doesn't win. And when I started seeing that, even, from friends within 3 months of being love people to going, no, I'm a justice person and love is the problem. And I would have despaired, but that's exactly when I read Jesus and the Disinherited. And I'm like, no, no. And so I'm grateful for those who maybe have understood how to not use love and forgiveness as a way to be actually complicit, right? Where it turns into covering up and to setting aside, looking at the hard stuff. But no, the real cruciform love,
Yes,
self-giving, kenotic kind of love that he talked about, it's like, okay, that's a hill to die on.
yes.
And because many have, and I think that is our hope. So
One of my favorite Thurman sermons is the sermon he preached after Martin Luther King was murdered.
okay.
And you hear him, because Martin was so dear to him, you hear his grief, but you also hear him trying to hold space and give wisdom to young people who really wanted to go out and just burn things down. And I remember after George Floyd's murder, getting my Audible out and pulling up that sermon and just playing it over and over again, because I admired a person who could hold the grief, acknowledge the grief, be real about the anger and the feelings, and yet say, there's a way of love that can move us forward. And I think our history in all aspects is important. The same with Frederick Douglass. But you have these people who have been there, who have traversed the lives of oppression and the hard points, and yet they still were able to tune into this rhythm that invites us to do both, to hold both. And I by no means am an expert at this. I am learning and living as I go, but I don't want erasure for who I am. I am, I very much love being a Black woman. And I very much love and honor the truth of my being and our being interconnected in humanity. And what I hope as a way forward is there's a place not where we see culture as the thing that divides us, but as a point of kenosis, where we can empty our love into one another, and in a way that appreciates and honors and esteems and allows for, that is very accepting, just like you see with Father, Jesus, and Holy Spirit, and that is a place that I hope we get to without fear, without the shame, without even the, usurp of power that we think is how we create a new way. But I do think it's going to take a different model than what we have now to get there.
Well, it's instead of hierarchy or anarchy, you're describing kenarchy, of the leadership of kenosis, and you've just modeled that for an hour. I mean, this must be, even though I'm completely for you, it's still got to be exhausting. And I hear that a lot. And I also hear people say, we're so exhausted, do your own research. But then folks are like, where do I look? And I would say this hour has been research. Reading Howard Thurman's book, listening to that sermon would be research. Anybody else you want to send us to before we call her a day?
There's a couple, really good books out there. For me, I start with Thurman. I have found Rhonda McGee. She has a more recent book called The Inner Work of Racial Justice. And I think it's a very well-balanced book. And I like it because it's more like a guide. There's some really great questions and things that are asked that people can sit with. And so I recommend her as well. But I think Howard Thurman has enough books, and he does a very good job in the back with his bibliography. Dr. Barbara Holmes is another voice that I would recommend. She has a book out now called Race and the Cosmos. And she has a book getting ready to be released either September or October called Contemplation in Crisis.
Oh, very good.
About the village of our humanity, I think is the subtitle of it. I'll have to find the name for you, but
Okay.
I'm excited for her new work that's coming out.
Well, thanks so much, Felicia. I'm going to stop recording now, unless you have any last words for us, and then we'll just chat for a minute after.
Okay. Thanks for having me.